My father-in-law just raised a glass of $300 scotch and toasted to the fact that I'd be homeless by February. 40 people, my entire family, stood up and applauded my divorce while I was still holding my dessert fork. They thought they were watching my life end. They didn't realize they were currently sitting in a restaurant that I've secretly owned for 3 years. This is the story of how I stopped being the handyman and started being the man who owned their world. My name is Owen Briggs. I'm 34 years old, and for the last decade, I've spent my days covered in sawdust and wood stain as a furniture restoration craftsman. I take broken things and make them whole again. Antique dressers with cracked drawers, rocking chairs that survived 3 world wars, and dining tables that hosted 50 years of family dinners. People bring me their legacies, and I bring them back to life with my hands. It's honest, grueling work that leaves your back aching and your fingernails permanently stained, but it's good work. To my wife's family, the Thornberrys, it meant I was a zero. My wife Delia and I met 9 years ago at a county fair. She was different then. She laughed easily, and she didn't care that I drove a truck with a mismatched fender or that my clothes came from thrift store bins. She used to sit on a stool in my shop for hours, claiming she loved my hands and the way I could create beauty from wreckage. We got married 2 years later in a courthouse ceremony. Her parents barely showed up, looking like they were attending a funeral. Vance Thornberry owns 4 massive car dealerships across the state. He is loud, wealthy, and made it his personal mission to remind me at every Sunday brunch that I wasn't a real provider. His wife, Lorraine, was the good cop, delivering insults wrapped in silk and well-meaning concern. Then there was Hollis, Delia's younger brother, a 29-year-old who never held a job his daddy didn't buy him, yet mocked my calloused hands while sipping $30 cocktails. For 8 years, I became a human sponge, soaking up every condescending smirk. I kept my head down and worked 14-hour shifts, praying Delia would stay the woman I married. But the Thornberry rot is contagious. Slowly, she stopped defending me. She stopped looking at me altogether. By the end, I was a ghost in my own house, living with a woman who seemed physically pained by my existence. The only real family I ever had was my mother, Ruth. She worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over us until she passed when I was 25. The person who kept me grounded after that was her brother, my Uncle Clement. He was a mountain of a man who lived in a cabin an hour outside the city. He wore the same flannel shirts for 20 years and drove a truck that sounded like a blender full of marbles. When I turned 18, sitting on his porch amidst the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, he handed me a matte black card. It had no bank logo, no magnetic strip, just heavy cold metal with his name embossed in silver, Clement Farrow. I looked at that silver name, having no idea then that it was a name whispered in the back rooms of the Senate and on private jets. I just thought it was the name of a man who liked sawdust. "Keep this in your wallet, Owen," he told me, his voice gravelly. "Don't use it unless you truly, deeply need it. But when you do, they're going to know exactly who you are." Uncle Clement passed away 3 years ago, taking his secrets with him. I never tried to run the card at a gas station. I kept it tucked behind my driver's license, a heavy piece of the only man who ever truly respected me. The night before Christmas Eve, the illusion of my marriage finally shattered. I was standing in the hallway, shadows stretching across the floor, when I heard Delia on the phone in the kitchen. "I know, Mom," she said, her voice cold. "I should have listened to you from the beginning. It was a mistake." I stood there frozen, the smell of the pine garlands suddenly making me nauseous. She didn't know I heard every syllable of my life being dismissed. The next evening, we drove to the Winthrop in a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the car. Delia was draped in a deep red dress and diamond earrings Vance had given her that probably cost $40,000. I wore my only nice shirt, the one I saved for occasions where I had to pretend I belonged in her world. My tie felt like a noose, The Winthrop was the kind of place that thrived on making people feel small. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow, and the white marble floors reflected the golden light, like a mirror. Waiters in tailored suits moved between tables like ghosts trained in elegance. Honestly, I felt like a trespasser the second we crossed the threshold. Vance had reserved a private dining room that smelled of expensive cigar smoke and old money. When we arrived, the long table was already packed with 42 Thornberries and their well-manicured business associates. It was a sea of navy blazers and pearls, all centered around Vance, who sat at the head of the table like a king surveying subjects. He wore a suit that cost more than I made in 3 months of hard labor. Delia walked straight to her mother, taking the seat they'd kept for her without looking back. I followed like a stray dog, nodding to relatives, who barely acknowledged I was in the room. The conversation was a dizzying blur of European vacations and hedge fund mergers. I sat there in total silence, methodically cutting a piece of Wagyu beef I couldn't even taste. Vance's voice sliced across the mahogany like a jagged blade, cutting through the murmurs of 42 people. "What the hell are you doing, Owen?" I didn't look at him. Honestly, I couldn't bring myself to. I kept my focus entirely on the waiter. Vance let out that booming, condescending laugh, the one I'd heard in my nightmares for 8 long years. "Did you hear that, everyone? Owen wants to pay for dinner. The man who fixes broken chairs for a living wants to pick up a tab that's probably more than he makes in 6 months of manual labor." The table erupted in a fresh wave of mockery. Hollis nearly choked on his bourbon, gasping out, "Maybe he's planning to wash dishes in the back to pay it off. 1 plate at a time. Repairman." Lorraine just shook her head, wearing that look of mock sympathy that always made my skin crawl. "Owen dear, don't make this more embarrassing for yourself. We all know your situation." Delia finally turned toward me. Her face was a mixture of confusion and pure irritation. "Owen, stop it. This is pathetic. You're just making this harder than it needs to be." I didn't answer her. I just reached into my back pocket and pulled out my old weathered leather wallet. I opened it and found the matte black card. It had been sitting there, tucked away, for 16 years. It felt different in my hand tonight. Heavier, more significant, like a key to a door I hadn't realized was right in front of me. I handed it to the waiter. "Use this," I said. The waiter took the card with a practiced motion, glancing at it the way he would any other piece of plastic. But then he stopped. His eyes went wide. Every bit of color drained from his face as his thumb traced the silver-embossed name, Clement Farrow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the card, then at my face, then back at the card, as if he were holding a live grenade. "Is there a problem?" I asked calmly. The waiter swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, please excuse me for just 1 moment. I need to speak with my manager, immediately." He turned and practically ran toward the private staff door at the end of the hall. Vance snorted, leaning back in his chair with an air of smug triumph. "Well, that's that. Card's probably declined. Or maybe it's a fake. Did the bank laugh you out of the building, Owen? Or is it just expired like your marriage?" I said nothing. I just sat there, with my hands folded, watching the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. 2 minutes passed, in a strange, tense silence. Then, the door swung open. The waiter returned, walking with a strange, rigid urgency. Behind him was a man in an impeccable charcoal suit, Mr. Dunmore, the general manager. He carried himself with an authority that usually made Vance look like a toddler, but as he approached our table, his eyes were locked on me with a look I'd never seen before. It was pure, unadulterated respect. Mr. Dunmore walked directly to my chair. Ignoring the rest of the Thornberry family entirely, he extended his hand. "Mr. Briggs?" I stood and shook it. "That's me." His voice was formal, warm, and deeply deferential. "Sir, I must apologize. We had no idea you would be joining us this evening. If we had known, we would have made very different arrangements for your arrival." Vance leaned forward, his smirk finally beginning to waver. "What the hell is going on here? Dunmore? Who do you think you're talking to?" The manager didn't even acknowledge Vance's existence. "Mr. Briggs, we've contacted the estate's legal team, and they've confirmed everything. Your uncle's instructions were very specific. The moment you presented this card, we were to activate all protocols immediately." My heart was thudding against my ribs, like a trapped bird. But I kept my face a mask of stone. "What protocols?" Mr. Dunmore leaned in, and the entire room went so silent you could hear the snow hitting the window panes. Every pair of eyes was fixed on us. "Sir, your uncle founded this company. He owned it entirely, and upon his passing 3 years ago, full ownership transferred to you." He paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. "Mr. Briggs, you own this entire restaurant. In fact, you own the entire Feral Hospitality Group." The silence that followed was a physical entity. It wasn't just the absence of talking. It was as if the Winthrop's ventilation system had died, and the very oxygen in the room had turned to stone. I watched the realization ripple down that long mahogany table, like a slow-motion car crash. Vance's champagne glass stopped exactly halfway to his mouth. A drop of the expensive vintage trembled on the rim, before falling onto his navy silk tie. His jaw didn't just drop. It sagged. His face was caught in a grotesque mask between the smugness he'd held seconds ago and a rising, panicked disbelief. He looked like a man who had just realized the floor he was standing on was actually a trap door. To his right, Lorraine's perfectly curated socialite mask finally shattered. Her eyes darted frantically between my face and Mr. Dunmore's charcoal suit. Her pupils dilated as she waited for a punchline that wasn't coming. I glanced at Hollis, and the sight was almost poetic. His flagship smartphone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the dead air. And then, there was Delia. My wife, or the woman who had handed me my walking papers 10 minutes ago, was staring at me as if I were a ghost. She didn't look happy, and she didn't look sad. She looked like she was seeing me for the first true time, and she couldn't handle the view. I could see her throat move as she swallowed, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles were the color of the white linen. Mr. Dunmore continued speaking, his voice crisp and professional, dropping tactical nukes on the Thornberry family ego. "Mr. Briggs, your Uncle Clement Farrell founded Feral Hospitality 42 years ago," he explained. "He started with a single diner and built it into one of the most prestigious hospitality groups in the country. The Winthrop is our flagship, but the portfolio includes 37 restaurants and 12 luxury hotels across the United States." I felt the room tilt. I thought about Uncle Clement's beat-up truck and his cabin that smelled like cedar and old books. "I never knew any of this," I managed to say, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. It was surreal. I had spent a decade feeling like a failure, while the keys to a kingdom were sitting in my back pocket the whole time. "That was by design, sir," Dunmore replied with a slight, knowing nod. "Your uncle left very specific instructions with the estate's legal team. He wanted you to live your life on your own terms, without the burden of wealth, until you were ready. The black card was the litmus test. He told us that the moment you finally presented it, it would mean you were prepared to step into your inheritance." Vance finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled, desperate bark. He slammed his palm on the table, making the silverware dance a frantic metallic jig. "This is absurd. This is some kind of elaborate, low-rent prank," he was shouting now, his face turning a dangerous shade of deep purple. "Owen is a nobody. He's a guy who fixes broken chairs in a garage he can barely afford. There is no possible way he owns anything, let alone this building." Mr. Dunmore didn't even flinch at the outburst. He just turned toward Vance with a look of icy, professional disdain. The kind that made the billionaire car dealer look like a toddler having a tantrum. "Sir, I can assure you that our legal department has thoroughly verified Mr. Briggs's identity," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Every document has been authenticated by the Farrell estate. Mr. Owen Briggs is the sole owner of Farrell Hospitality Group and all its subsidiaries." I stood up slowly. The movement felt incredibly light, as if the 8 years of gravity the Thornberrys had forced on me had suddenly vanished. I reached for my coat, the same one they'd mocked for being out of style, and I slipped it on with a deliberate calm. Honestly, the audacity of their shock was almost funny. They were offended because the man they'd treated like trash was actually the one who owned the bin. "Mr. Dunmore, please send tonight's bill to my office tomorrow morning," I said, looking the manager right in the eye. "The entire dinner is on me. Consider it my final gift to the Thornberry family, a small reminder of the man they thought was worthless." I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on the table and started walking toward the exit, my boots clicking firmly against the marble. "Owen, wait!" Delia's voice cracked through the room, high and frantic. I heard the scrape of her chair against the floor and the rustle of her silk dress as she scrambled to follow me. I felt her hand brush against my arm, a touch that used to mean home, but now it just felt like a cold breeze. I didn't slow down, and I didn't flinch. At the heavy oak doors of the private room, I paused. I turned back one last time. 42 faces were frozen in a tableau of pure, unadulterated shock. They looked like statues in a museum of fallen pride. Vance was still clutching his wine glass. Lorraine was motionless, and Delia was standing there, halfway between her family and the exit, looking completely lost. "My uncle once told me that a man's worth isn't measured by the weight of his wallet," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of that silent room. "He said it's measured by how he treats people when he thinks no one important is watching." I let that sink in. Tonight, I watched all of you, and now I know exactly what you're worth. I pushed the doors open. I walked out through the lobby, past the crystal chandeliers and the bowing staff, and into the cold December night. The snow was falling in thick, soft flakes, blanketing the city in a clean, quiet white. The air was sharp, it smelled of winter. And for the first time in 8 long years, the pressure in my chest was gone. I could finally breathe. I kept walking, and I never once looked back at the lights of the Winthrop. The days that followed that Christmas dinner, they were the quietest of my life. I drove back to the small, sterile house I had shared with Delia. The air still smelled faintly of her expensive candles and the coldness of our final months. I didn't wait for her to come home to stage a dramatic confrontation. I simply packed a single leather suitcase with my clothes and my basic tools. I left before the sun came up, leaving my key on the granite kitchen island without a note. I didn't want explanations, and I certainly didn't want the hollow apologies I knew were coming. Once the shock wore off and the greed kicked in, I just wanted to close that heavy, suffocating chapter and start fresh in a world that didn't require a mask. The divorce went through at a speed that, honestly, made my head spin. Delia's lawyers, smelling the scent of a multi-million-dollar estate, tried to contest the filing almost immediately. They argued that she hadn't been fully aware of my financial assets and that she was entitled to a massive slice of the Farrell inheritance. But here is the thing about irony. It has a wicked sense of humor. The ironclad prenuptial agreement her father had literally forced me to sign years ago, the one designed to keep me from ever touching a cent of the Thornberry fortune, it worked perfectly in reverse. Because I had inherited the company outside of the marriage and kept it separate, Delia had legally signed away any claim to it before she even knew it existed. She got exactly what she had planned to leave me with. Absolutely nothing. I heard through the grapevine. A few months later, that Vance's main dealership lost its lease. I didn't go out of my way to ruin him. I didn't have to. I simply didn't renew the contract when it landed on my desk at the Farrell headquarters. Honestly, it wasn't about revenge. It was about zero obligation. I had no reason to continue a business relationship with a man who spent 8 years trying to systematically dismantle my self-worth. Vance ended up relocating to a cramped, dusty lot on the outskirts of town, somewhere with 0 foot traffic. Within a year, 2 more of his locations folded under the weight of mounting debt and a reputation that was finally catching up to him. The man who once mocked me for fixing broken junk was now the one struggling to keep his own empire from falling completely apart. About 6 months after the papers were finalized, I received a thick, cream-colored envelope in the mail. It was a 3-page letter from Lorraine. It was written in her perfect, flowing calligraphy, the kind that always felt like it was trying too hard. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. She claimed she had always seen my potential. She said Vance's behavior didn't reflect her true feelings. She actually had the audacity to suggest we meet for coffee, to bridge the gap and move forward as friends. I read it once, felt that old, familiar flicker of annoyance, and then I folded it neatly and dropped it into the trash can. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to be burned, so you can't ever accidentally wander back across them. Hollis tried his luck too. He slid into my DMs with a suddenly bro-y tone, acting like we hadn't spent the last decade in a state of mutual loathing. He claimed he had some disruptive business ideas and thought maybe I could fund his next venture, since we were practically brothers. I blocked his number and his social accounts without typing a single word. I wasn't about to fund the lifestyle of a man who viewed hard work as a punchline. Then, there was the call from Delia. It happened late on a Tuesday night, 4 months after the Winthrop explosion. I was sitting in my new apartment, a space that finally felt like it belonged to me, when my phone vibrated with her name. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. Her voice was soft, tremulous, and completely shattered. She sounded nothing like the Ice Queen who had slid those papers across the table. She told me she'd made a terrible mistake. She claimed the pressure from her parents had confused her, and that she'd been living in a fog. She actually said she still loved me. She asked if there was any chance, even a tiny one, that we could try to find our way back to the county fair days. I let the silence hang for a long moment, just listening to her shaky breathing on the other end of the line. "You had everything, Delia," I finally said, and I meant it. "You had a husband who adored you, who would have moved mountains for you when you were still the girl I met 9 years ago. That was worth more than any bank account could ever hold." I paused, thinking about the look in her eyes when she thought I was nothing. "But I can't unsee the way you looked at me when you handed me those papers. Goodbye, Delia." I hung up. I never looked at her name on a screen again. I took over the operations of Farrell Hospitality, but I did it my way. I didn't want a corner office with a view of the skyline and an assistant who was afraid to tell me the truth. I spent my first months in the trenches. I visited every restaurant. I walked through every hotel lobby. I learned the names of the line cooks, the housekeepers who worked the night shifts, and the valets who stood in the rain. I made sure birthdays were celebrated. I made sure family emergencies were met with actual support, instead of HR paperwork. I became the kind of leader Uncle Clement would have been proud of, someone who led with a handshake instead of a memo. And yet, I still spent my weekends in my little workshop. I kept it surrounded by the smell of sawdust and linseed oil. My restoration business remained my private sanctuary. I still take on projects when a piece of furniture has a story that needs saving. It keeps me grounded. It reminds me that while I might own the building now, I'm still the same guy who knows how to sand a surface until it's as smooth as glass. About a year after the divorce, I was working on an old oak table with a stubborn finish when I noticed something odd. There was a false back to one of the drawers, stuck shut by years of humidity and old varnish. I pried it open with a chisel and found a single yellowed envelope tucked inside. It was a letter from Uncle Clement, dated years before his passing. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. "Owen," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you finally used the card. I never told you about the money because I wanted you to become a good man on your own terms, without the rot that wealth can bring to the unprepared. Anyone can be kind when their pockets are full. The real test of a man is how he treats the world when he thinks he has nothing." The letter continued, "You passed that test every single day I watched you. You worked hard, you stayed humble, and you loved people without a single condition. That's why I left it all to you. Not because you needed the money, but because you deserve the responsibility. Use it wisely. Stay good. And remember, the people who love you when you have nothing are the only ones worth keeping when you have everything. I love you, son. Uncle Clement." I sat in that quiet workshop for hours, the letter resting on my knees as the sun set. For 8 years, I had let the Thornberrys convince me that I was worthless because I didn't have their status. I believed their lies because I thought worth was something you could calculate on a spreadsheet. But Uncle Clement knew the truth. Worth is about character. It's about integrity and the quiet dignity of showing up to do the work when no one is watching. That Christmas dinner didn't just change my financial status. It saved my soul by showing me exactly who was truly poor in that room. They had the money, but they were bankrupt in everything that actually mattered. So, if you're listening to this right now, and you feel invisible, or if you feel like the world has already decided you're a nobody, I need you to hear me. Your value is not defined by people who are too small to see your potential. Keep your head down, keep your heart open, and stay true to the person you are in the dark. Your moment is coming, and when it arrives, just make sure you're still the person who deserves to win. I'm Owen Briggs, and for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Seriously, if this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own strength, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below and tell me what would you have done in my shoes. I read every single comment, and I love hearing your perspectives. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and tap that bell so you never miss another story. We post emotional and inspiring stories like this every single day. Thanks for being part of this community, and I'll see you in the next one.